It all began with something simple, something the narrator never thought would escalate into a community-wide spectacle. The pond, tucked neatly in the corner of his backyard, had been his little project for years. It wasn't a huge pond, nor was it the kind of artificial water feature that homeowners associations usually feature in glossy brochures. Instead, it was a modest basin of water, dug with his own hands lined with stone edging, and fed by rainwater runoff that trickled down from the slight slope of his lawn. To him, the pond was a sanctuary. In the mornings, sunlight shimmered on its surface like liquid glass, reflecting patches of sky and drifting clouds. Birds often dipped to sip from the edges, and dragonflies skimmed across the top like tiny blue sparks. He had installed a small solar-powered fountain to keep the water moving, which added a soft gurgle that broke the silence of summer afternoons. It wasn't extravagant, but it was alive, and that was what mattered most to him. But to one person, the woman who had made herself infamous on their street, it was nothing more than an eyesore. Karen. The name carried weight, almost like a curse, whispered among neighbors whenever someone mentioned complaints, rules, or letters stuffed into mailboxes at odd hours. She had a knack for finding problems where no one else saw them, and the narrator's pond had, unfortunately, made her list. From her vantage point across the street, she declared it looked less like a charming garden feature and more like an abandoned swamp. She claimed the water was stagnant, even though the fountain kept it circulating. She claimed it would attract mosquitoes, even though mosquito dunks had been added regularly. And most of all, she declared it was against the aesthetic of the neighborhood, a vague phrase she often used when her personal taste didn't align with reality. At first, the narrator ignored her. After all, one person's opinion shouldn't dictate what another could do with their yard. But Karen was not a woman who thrived on being ignored. She began with subtle hints, mentioning to neighbors that she was concerned about the pond. Then came letters to the Homeowners Association, each written in her sharp, angular handwriting. Finally, she escalated to photos slipped under doors, taken from the street with captions pointing out the so-called swamp. The HOA, never missing an opportunity to meddle, sent a letter to the narrator. It wasn't a fine, at least not yet, but it was worded sternly. The pond, they said, was creating a potential nuisance. The letter encouraged remediation before further action might be considered. It was exactly the kind of vague bureaucratic language that left plenty of room for escalation. The narrator stood in his backyard holding that letter and looking at his pond. The fountain bubbled quietly. The surface glittered under the afternoon sun. And a robin hopped along the edge looking for worms. A nuisance? He didn't see one. What he saw was a chance to turn this around. If they wanted to call his pond a swamp, then he would give them something that could never be mistaken for anything less than a feature. Something not just acceptable, but extraordinary. That night he researched. Fish ponds, koi gardens, backyard aquariums, all the ways a simple basin of water could transform into a thriving ecosystem. He read articles, scrolled through forums, and even reached out to a local landscaping supply store for advice. The idea that took root was simple. Stock the pond with fish. Not just any fish, but colorful, active species that would shimmer beneath the surface, that children could marvel at, that neighbors couldn't possibly ignore. Within a week, he had a plan. He cleaned the pond thoroughly, scrubbing away every trace of debris Karen might have photographed as evidence. He installed a stronger pump and filter to keep the water crystal clear. He added new stones around the border, polishing the edges so the pond looked like a deliberate design rather than a haphazard pit. He planted water lilies and marginal plants to soften the look and add bursts of green and pink. Then came the fish, bright flashes of orange koi, playful goldfish, and even a few hardy minnows swam into their new home, darting through the water like living jewels. Their presence changed everything. The pond no longer looked like a still basin of rainwater. It pulsed with life. Each movement beneath the surface caught the eye. Each ripple told a story of motion and energy. The transformation was immediate. Children walking home from school slowed down to peer over the fence. Parents stopped on evening walks to point out the fish to their little ones. Even the mail carrier paused one day to lean over the edge and admire the colorful spectacle. What had once been dismissed as a swamp had become a gathering point of fascination, but Karen did not share in the delight. If anything, her anger grew sharper. With each day, the pond attracted attention. She muttered about safety, warning that children might fall in if they leaned too far. She complained about noise, claiming the upgraded fountain disrupted the peace. She accused the narrator of trying to show off, twisting what was meant as a simple act of joy into a petty competition. The more she complained, the more the pond thrived. The fish grew bolder, the lilies bloomed wider, and the water sparkled in the sunlight like a mirror of defiance. For every letter Karen sent to the HOA, more neighbors stopped by to admire the view, snapping photos and praising the ingenuity. The HOA, caught between her constant stream of complaints and the obvious popularity of the pond, hesitated to take further action. By the end of that summer, the pond was more than just a backyard feature. It had become a landmark, a symbol of quiet rebellion against pettiness and control. Families brought breadcrumbs to toss to the fish. Teenagers used it as a backdrop for social media photos. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began gathering near the fence, chatting about how nice it was to have something so unique in their community. And all the while, Karen fumed. Her attempt to shame the pond into removal had backfired spectacularly. The swamp, as she had called it, had transformed into a jewel of the neighborhood. But Karen was not the type to admit defeat. As autumn crept in and leaves began to fall into the water, she grew quieter, not because she had given up, but because she was planning. There was a sharpness in her eyes, a determination that hinted at her next move. She had lost the first battle, but she was preparing for the next. The narrator, however, was ready too. The pond had taught him something important. Sometimes the best response to criticism is not defense, but transformation. What began as an accusation of neglect had blossomed into something undeniable. And as winter approached, both sides waited. The pond shimmered beneath the pale sun, the fish darted happily, and the neighborhood buzzed with admiration. But beneath the surface of peace, tension brewed. Because in a neighborhood governed by rules, complaints, and appearances, nothing stayed calm for long. Winter had always been a quiet time in the neighborhood. The lawns dulled under frost, garden ornaments disappeared into storage, and the streets carried fewer footsteps as people retreated indoors. Yet even in the stillness of the colder months, the pond stood out. The fountain trickled softly beneath the thin crusts of ice that formed at the edges, and the fish, protected by a deeper section, dug deliberately to withstand the chill, moved slowly, conserving their energy in the frigid water. For the narrator, the pond remained a small oasis, even under the muted colors of winter. But for Karen, silence was never the same as surrender. She had not forgotten the Battle of Autumn, and as the new year dawned, her efforts to dismantle the pond, and by extension the narrator's peace, began anew with sharpened focus. Her first step was documentation. Neighbors noticed her walking slowly past the pond almost daily, clutching her phone like a weapon. She crouched near the fence to snap photos of fallen leaves in the water, claiming they were evidence of neglect. She filmed short clips of the fountain on windy days, insisting the spray landed on the sidewalk, creating hazards. She even recorded the faintest trickle of water during the night, sending these clips to the HOA board as though she were presenting undeniable proof of wrongdoing. At first, the board was hesitant to act. The pond had gained popularity, after all, and no one could deny the charm it brought to the block. But Karen's persistence was relentless. Each meeting she attended, she raised the issue. Each letter she sent carried the same insistent tone. The pond was a nuisance, a danger, a disruption to the carefully curated uniformity of their community. Eventually, her persistence forced the HOA's hand. A notice arrived, more severe than the first. This time it outlined potential violations regarding property safety and water management. It suggested that the pond could be in breach of bylaws relating to standing water, despite the clear evidence of circulation and maintenance. A fine was threatened should adjustments not be made. The narrator stood in his yard reading the letter, snow crunching beneath his boots, his breath hanging in the air like smoke. For a moment, frustration welled up inside him. He had followed every guideline, improved the pond beyond anything resembling neglect, and yet here it was again, another attempt to strip away something that brought not just him, but the entire neighborhood joy. But as the chill seeped into his bones, He decided once again that frustration would not win. If Karen wanted to fight, he would respond not with anger, but with expansion. If she wanted to call his pond a swamp, he would turn it into something so undeniably beautiful, so utterly woven into the fabric of the community, that removing it would become unthinkable. When spring returned, the narrator acted. He didn't just clean the pond, he reimagined it. The small basin that had once been a modest feature grew larger, carved deeper, lined with smooth stone that caught the sunlight. A small waterfall was added, cascading over rocks, filling the air with the calming sound of moving water. Plants flourished at its edges, reeds swaying, lilies spreading broad leaves across the surface, and irises blooming in bursts of purple and yellow. And the fish, they multiplied. Bright new koi darted through the water, their colors vivid against the dark depths. Schools of minnows shimmered like liquid silver. Even a few ornamental species were added, creatures so striking that they drew gasps from anyone who leaned over the edge to see them. But the expansion didn't stop at the pond itself. Around its borders, benches were placed, inviting neighbors to sit and linger. Decorative lanterns lined the path leading to the water, glowing softly at night like fireflies. A trellis covered in flowering vines arched nearby, creating the perfect frame for photos. What had once been a backyard pond was now a community centerpiece, a small park tucked into the heart of suburban sameness. The response from neighbors was immediate and overwhelming. Families gathered in the evenings, children tossing fish food into the water and squealing as the koi surfaced in hungry splashes. Teenagers posed for pictures with the waterfall behind them, their smiles illuminated by the lanterns. Even those who rarely spoke to anyone found themselves drawn to the serenity of the space, lingering on the benches as though the pond had always been there, waiting for them. The HOA board, sensing the shift in public sentiment, grew quieter. They were not blind to the tide of support swelling around the narrator's creation. Where once they had leaned toward Karen's ceaseless complaints, now they hesitated, unwilling to provoke a backlash from the very residents they were supposed to serve. But Karen did not relent. If anything, her frustration boiled hotter than ever. She claimed the benches invited loitering. She claimed the lanterns wasted electricity, even though they were solar-powered. She complained that the sound of the waterfall was intrusive during the night, though most neighbors described it as soothing. One evening, she marched into an HOA meeting and demanded immediate removal of the pond, presenting her photos, her videos, her stack of letters as though sheer volume could drown out the voices of dozens who admired the space. But this time, something shifted. The board listened, yes, but they also heard the quiet murmurs of the other homeowners in attendance, murmurs of disagreement, of annoyance at her persistence, of support for the narrator's pond. For the first time, Karen found herself outnumbered. Her voice, once the sharpest and loudest, faltered against the weight of community opinion. And yet, even as the tide turned against her, she refused to accept defeat. She began speaking in hushed tones to anyone who would listen, spreading rumors about health hazards, about property values, about imaginary risks. She tried to frame the pond not as a triumph, but as a ticking time bomb. The narrator, however, saw her tactics for what they were: desperation. And rather than match her bitterness, he leaned into kindness. He welcomed neighbors openly to visit the pond. He hosted a small community day, inviting children to learn about the fish, handing out cups of food to toss into the water. Parents snapped photos, grateful for a safe, engaging place for their kids. Older residents found joy in sitting near the water, reminiscing about their own gardens and ponds from years past. What Karen had tried to isolate became a point of unity. The pond wasn't just his anymore, it belonged to everyone, and that made it stronger than any single complaint could weaken. By the height of summer, the pond was in full bloom. Water lilies spread across the surface. Koi darted like streaks of fire beneath the glassy ripples, and the waterfall sparkled in the sunlight. The benches were rarely empty, the lanterns glowed nightly, and laughter often echoed across the yard. Karen's bitterness was palpable. She kept her blinds shut when families gathered near the pond. She scowled when children pointed and laughed at the fish. Her home, once her fortress of control, now felt overshadowed by the life and energy spilling from across the street. The HOA, sensing the futility of siding with her, quietly dropped the issue. Letters ceased. Fines disappeared. The board shifted their attention to other matters, leaving the pond to thrive without interference. But Karen's anger did not fade. It simmered, festering beneath the surface like a storm cloud waiting for release. Everyone could feel it, that sense that she was planning something, some last, desperate attempt to reclaim her authority. And as the long days of summer stretched on, the narrator remained vigilant. He knew this battle was not over. He knew Karen too well to believe she would ever truly stop. The pond shimmered under the sun, a jewel of the neighborhood, a place of joy and gathering. But beneath its calm waters, tension lingered. Because in a neighborhood ruled by pettiness and pride, peace was always temporary. Summer had painted the neighborhood in its brightest shades. Lawns glowed in deep green, the air buzzed with cicadas, and children raced through sprinklers, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. In the center of it all, the pond thrived. It no longer felt like a backyard feature. It had become a living landmark, a gathering place that pulsed with life. Neighbors treated it as part of their daily rhythm. Morning walkers paused at its benches, teenagers gathered to feed the fish, and families lingered in the evenings under the lantern light. But in the midst of joy, tension still hovered. Karen had grown quieter in public, but her silence was not peace. It was the heavy stillness of someone plotting, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her blinds stayed drawn most days, but neighbors whispered of seeing her pacing in her living room, phone pressed tightly to her ear, her face twisted with determination. Then came the notice. It wasn't just another flimsy letter of complaint. This was thicker, stamped with official lettering, and addressed directly to the narrator. Inside, the HOA claimed that the pond constituted an unapproved structural modification, a phrase broad enough to serve as a weapon. They demanded its removal within 30 days, citing bylaws never before enforced, bylaws Karen had likely dug up through relentless searching. Failure to comply, they threatened, would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. The letter hit like a thunderclap. After months of growth and acceptance, after countless families had embraced the pond, the HOA was preparing its strongest strike yet. And everyone knew whose hands were guiding it. At first, neighbors rallied in quiet outrage. They came by to voice their support, shaking their heads at the injustice. Parents whispered about drafting a petition. Teenagers scrawled slogans like "Save the Pond" on notebooks and social media. But Karen, sensing momentum, grew bolder. She began speaking loudly during her evening walks, telling anyone within earshot that the pond was a health hazard, a breeding ground for mosquitoes, a violation of the very rules that held the neighborhood together. Her words dripped with confidence now, as though she could already see the pond drained and filled with dirt. She seemed to believe that this time victory was certain. But the narrator was not willing to surrender. He had watched the pond evolve from a small idea into something larger than himself. It wasn't just a body of water anymore. It was a symbol of resistance, of creativity, of the possibility of joy in a neighborhood too often smothered by uniformity and pettiness. If Karen wanted war, then this would be the final battle. The response began with unity. Neighbors who had once avoided HOA drama stepped forward. A petition circulated, gathering dozens of signatures within days. Photos of the pond filled social media feeds, captioned with heartfelt notes about community and beauty. Parents spoke of the joy it brought their children, retirees spoke of the peace it gave them, and teenagers declared it their favorite spot in the whole neighborhood. The board, overwhelmed by the sudden surge of attention, tried to quiet the storm. They scheduled a hearing, inviting both sides to present their cases. The narrator prepared meticulously, gathering not just support but evidence. Water tests proving the pond was safe, records of maintenance, and even recognition from a local gardening society that had praised the pond as a model of sustainable landscaping. When the day of the hearing arrived, the atmosphere felt electric. The meeting room overflowed with residents, many standing against the walls or sitting cross-legged on the floor. Karen entered with her usual stiff posture, her papers clutched tightly, her eyes sharp with determination. She radiated certainty, convinced that her years of persistence had finally paid off. But as the proceedings unfolded, her arguments faltered against the weight of community sentiment. Each time she pointed to a supposed problem, neighbors countered with stories of joy. When she claimed the pond lowered property values, a real estate agent stood up to state the opposite. Homes near the pond had attracted more attention from buyers. When she claimed it bred mosquitoes, parents described the dragonflies and fish that kept pests in check. Slowly, Karen's voice lost its edge. The more she spoke, the more isolated she seemed, surrounded not by allies but by neighbors united against her bitterness. And in the middle of it all, the narrator remained calm, letting the truth and the support of the community carry the weight of his case. By the end of the night, the board had no choice but to act. They withdrew their demand for removal, citing overwhelming community support. The pond, they declared reluctantly, would be allowed to remain, provided it continued to be maintained. The decision was final. The battle was over. The room erupted in applause. Children clapped, parents hugged, and even the most reserved neighbors smiled in relief. The pond had not just survived, it had triumphed. Karen, red-faced and trembling with fury, gathered her papers and stormed out, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. For the first time she had been publicly defeated, her authority shattered not by one person, but by the united voices of everyone around her. In the weeks that followed, the pond's legacy only grew stronger. News of the battle spread beyond the neighborhood, carried by local blogs and shared widely online. Visitors began to stop by, curious to see the famous pond that had stirred so much drama. Families posed for photos by the waterfall, teenagers filmed videos with the koi swimming behind them, and older residents from nearby streets wandered over just to sit by the benches. The pond had become more than a feature. It was now a landmark, a story woven into the identity of the neighborhood itself. And though Karen's house stood across the street, her blinds pulled tighter than ever, she could not erase what had been built. Her silence grew heavier, her presence diminished until she became little more than a bitter figure fading into the background of a community she had once tried to dominate. For the narrator, the victory was never about winning against her. It was about proving that creativity and joy could thrive even in the face of relentless opposition. Each ripple of the water, each flash of a koi beneath the surface, each burst of laughter from the children by the edge. These were reminders that beauty could endure no matter how hard someone tried to snuff it out. And so the pond lived on. It stood through the changing seasons, bright in summer, still and peaceful in winter, always drawing people together. What began as a petty complaint had blossomed into a symbol of unity. The neighborhood was no longer just rows of identical houses. It was a place with a heart, a place where water shimmered and fish darted, where neighbors gathered and memories grew. Karen had called it a swamp, but in the end, it became a sanctuary,